Hello and welcome to the Reformed Church Center and another colloquy in our series on understanding theological education in the RCA. Today, we are talking about ministerial formation in a Zoom world. We are very glad to have with us today Faye Taylor, who is Director of Field Education here at New Brunswick, as well as being Director of the New York program, but it is in her position with field education where she gets to do most of her thinking and talking about formation. And Daniel Meter, who is a retired RCA pastor living up in New Paltz. Daniel's very good at reflecting on lots of things and sharing his thoughts. And one of the things he's been reflecting on a lot lately has been the whole issue of how we do formation. The reason for having this colloquy is obviously that how we do formation has changed. I mean, when we really think about it, it like I say, is obvious. Once upon a time, people went off to seminary and lived there for 3 years. As recently as when Daniel and I were in seminary, we went off to seminary and we lived there for 3 years, and we only came out to do things at our church jobs and stuff like that. Before that, there was a time when potential ministers went off to seminary and didn't even go out for church jobs. You went off to seminary for 3 years and you lived there. And that sort of thing, of course, is a thing of the past. And now we're in an era where nobody lives on campus at New Brunswick. There is housing that's within half a block of campus. So I try to remind people that it takes no longer for anybody to walk from the current housing to their Greek class in the morning, if it happens in the morning, than it was when I was taking Greek at 8 in the morning at New Brunswick and living on the campus. It's just physically not there, but lots of people live at home, people commute, people are in second careers and therefore taking care of their first careers while still at seminary. And of course, during the recent pandemic, we had an entire year of no one being on campus to speak of. So it's a changing world. Formation is different from what it was. And today we hope to reflect on that. Daniel gets to begin, and he will reflect for a little while, and then Faye will reflect and then we will open up the floor to everybody. Daniel.
Thank you very much, and hello, my colleagues and friends. As James says, I have no particular expertise in any of these matters. It's just that when James asks me to ruminate, I can do so and have done so. And just to get some discussion started, probably everything I've written here, I will want to retract a week from now. I begin with 2 Peter 1, 5-7 and 10. For this very reason, you must make every effort to support your faith with goodness, and goodness with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with endurance, and endurance with godliness, and godliness with mutual affection, and mutual affection with love. Therefore, brothers and sisters, be all the more eager to confirm your call and election, for if you do this, you will never stumble. And then from the 3rd chapter of the same epistle, after his remarkably obscure eschatological discourse, since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, what sort of persons ought you to be in leading lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for the hastening of the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set ablaze and dissolved, and the elements will melt with fire? But in accordance with this promise, we wait for new heavens and new earth where righteousness is at home. The only certainty today is uncertainty. The only safe prediction is unpredictability. The earth is on fire and the patterns, stoicheia elements of weather and climate are dissolving. Political polarization, income disparity, and violence are on the increase, and the public square is more a battleground than a meeting place. We live in an era of technological innovation so rapid that this in itself makes cultural patterns uncertain and institutions unstable. Consider three inventions having to do with communication. Communication is so important to formation. Formation doesn't happen except through communication. Consider three inventions having to do with communication: the telegraph, the cassette tape, and the floppy disk. All three were revolutionary, but none of them are used today. In hindsight, we underestimate the cultural impact of the telegraph on Western civilization for almost a century, from 1838 to after the First World War. Had to do with and it changed the First World War. None of you have used the telegraph, I'm expecting, in recent times. And although the cassette tape and the floppy disk both had shorter lifetimes than the telegraph, they too unleashed cultural changes that have survived their obsolescence. What about Zoom? And I include here its competitors. We cannot predict how long we will be using Zoom or whatever succeeds it, and we haven't begun to understand its larger impact. If we cannot predict it, how can we plan on it? Is it possible to plan for unpredictability? No one planned on this pandemic, certainly not the developers of Zoom, for whom it has been a windfall. Most of us have had no prior interest in using Zoom, and many of us still dislike it, but use it we must. And we will still be using it, even if no pandemic requires it, from the new necessity of the convenience that we've now gotten used to. Market forces will require New Brunswick Seminary to keep using it. For all of its convenience, our use of Zoom has taught us its shortcomings. Most of us experience it as dispiriting, mentally draining, and emotionally unsatisfying. But those very shortcomings don't keep us out of McDonald's or Pizza Hut. We will likely surrender as usual to this next new dehumanization. Then how should we compensate when we use it in the practice of ministerial formation, an activity of humanization par excellence? Thus the relevance of this colloquy. I'm going to make a claim, a Reformed theological claim. What drives formation for Christian ministry is the message of the gospel. It is the gospel message that drives, directs, forms the formation of Christian ministry. Of course, by gospel message, I mean more than preaching. I mean the whole pastoral vocation. And more than Jesus saves, I mean the whole counsel of God, the knowledge of 2 Peter chapter 1. Not narrowly, but expansively, the gospel message drives the formation of a Christian ministry. The formation of a plumber is driven by the behavior of water and its management. The formation of a soldier is driven by the practice of violence for political purposes. In both cases, the formation requires physical training and activity, for which Zoom is entirely unsuitable. For how much of formation for ministry is Zoom unsuitable? How hands-on should our formation be? The answer to that will have to depend on a theological interpretation of the gospel message and all of its applications. A fundamentalist interpretation of the gospel, or even an evangelical interpretation, will yield different answers than a Reformed interpretation. I leave this undeveloped here for future reflection. Return with me to the examples of the plumber and the soldier. In both cases, their formation has little concern for their character. But if the formation of a minister is driven by the gospel message, then the character of the prospective minister is very much at stake. By character, I mean the, quote, goodness, self-control, endurance, godliness, affection, and love of 2 Peter. It is both by character and knowledge that, according to St. Peter, we confirm our call to the ministry. From this, 4 applications. First, to be trained in the message requires a constant conversion, not conversion in the popular sense of switching religions, but in the Reformed sense of Heidelberg 88 through 91. That is, the dying away of the old self and the coming to life of the new. the daily mortification, and the daily regeneration directed by the gospel and sustained by the sacraments. This, by the way, is the chief component in developing character for ministry, not psychology narrowly understood, not virtue in the case of classical education, but gospel conversion that you go through as a Christian in the development of character. Not to deny those other aspects, but this is the center of it. A preacher is always the first person in her own audience. And this essential factor of ministry formation takes place within the conscience and the heart. It's private, but it needs to be shared in the Christian community. Second, the community is critical to formation of Reformed pastors. Reformed pastors exercise their ministry within consistories and classes. A successful Reformed pastor edifies her consistory as her key spiritual community, the model community for the rest of the congregation. And she finds support and mutual accountability within the community of her classes. Also, the Reformed Church grounds its unity by balancing doctrine with relationships. And these relationships are challenged by the intentionally increasing diversity that we seek. Now that the seminary is non-residential, the group and therefore grouping community is so much harder to achieve. The grouping of Reformed Church seminarians into relatively stable cohorts that endure through the curriculum over the years is a necessity that can be enhanced by Zoom. This can be made, and you don't have to be residential to do it. This can be made to include students at other seminaries within cohorts that are based at New Brunswick. These cohorts can be guided by Reformed professors or by designated pastors serving as parish-based affiliated professors. I think Al Jansen, for example, using Zoom for weekly reflection groups, balanced by regular in-person short retreats. Third, the instruction reflection model has long been practiced at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. It is always guided by a professor and best takes place in groups. It would seem that such groups must be either all in-person or all remote. Mixed groups would put some participants at a disadvantage. On the other hand, individual tutoring can be done by Zoom without too much loss of formative value. Tutorials are costly, though, to both seminary budgets and professors' time constraints. The most economically efficient courses are lecture courses, which are neither particularly suited to the gospel message nor inimical to it. These work well enough via Zoom, depending on the screen skills of the professor. After all, our Lord gave sermons to thousands with only verbal illustrations. The distance imposed by a screen cannot be worse than that imposed by speaking from a fishing boat offshore. Fourth, and here is this is the biggest problem, and which instead of seminary, seminar. Fourth, the full and complex implications and applications of the gospel message for the life of the congregation and for the salvation of the world demand formation that includes a very great deal of sustained and close-up interaction. Think of our Lord and the 12. I'm talking here about an ongoing seminar, as it were, focused and disciplined and unapologetically intellectual, of conversation, investigation, challenge, resistance, recognition, synthesis, questions, insights, and discoveries, and of course, theological research. Such seminars can be thrilling, exciting, emotional, and even transformative, and they require serious preparation by the students and skilled leadership by the professors. Their value is enhanced when the group moves on together through the curriculum under different teachers. But doing them on Zoom would make them cold and thin. Here is a difficult problem to solve. I studied and taught at New Brunswick Seminary back in the days when most students were residents and Reformed. I must say with all candor and honesty that a residency was no guarantee of real spiritual or intellectual community. In fact, we often complained about the lack thereof. So, no matter how fearfully uncertain the world, the Lord Jesus tells us in Luke 21 not to fear and even to raise our heads. Every revolution is a new opportunity for the gospel, which is revolutionary in itself. Our certainty is not in familiar institutions or cultural elements, but in the new heavens and new earth where righteousness is at home. I offer it to you and I thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And now, Faye, it's your turn to share.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Daniel. And good afternoon, everyone who's joined us. In our conversation this summer, in preparation for today's colloquy, we framed part of the discussion on how do we reset the table in theological education, given the significant differences which now exist for students entering seminary to prepare for ministry in a Zoom environment. We recognize that the student brings his or her entire self to the process when they enter seminary. The culture and context in which the student has been formed, the embedded theologies to which the student has been exposed, and his or her own personal faith formation will undergo a transformation. What should be taken into consideration when preparing our current student demographic for a life of service in ministry during this unprecedented time? The question holds particular importance as we realize that the time marker going forward will be what happened before the pandemic and what happened after the pandemic for churches and for ministry and even for the academy. As we consider praxis, the seminary's role is to provide pedagogy that imparts knowledge, tools, and skill sets to minister to God's people through parish ministry, the academy, or in society at large. Matriculating students prior to March 20th entered New Brunswick to engage in a learning environment which placed them in a conventional classroom with face-to-face instructions while also participating in community. Online seminary options were available, but the choice was in-person theological education at New Brunswick. With the onset of the pandemic, it necessitated the seminary to make the abrupt shift to online virtual course delivery to maintain some continuity of learning for the students. The challenge was to create a virtual experience that provided connectivity for students. It also meant building courses that were interactive and engaging, mindful of the Zoom platform and also screen fatigue. Surveying students did reveal positive comments about the course delivery that was available. As the seminary made the pivot to virtual offerings, so churches had to also pivot. Preparation for ministry now includes expanding the use of technology in worship, Christian education, meetings, missions, and outreach, and so on. The virtual world is most likely here to stay in some form, and our students need to be prepared for it. What is consistent for the seminary's role in forming students for ministry, even in the Zoom world? That includes personal and vocational forming. Models of formation differ according to the perspective. As mentioned above, students come at various stages of personal formation. The movement from personal formation to vocational formation begins with the personal practices of spiritual disciplines, along with seminary experiences that contribute to the student's total formation and building character. Daniel Mellett writes in Finding Your Way in Seminary that theological education is an initiation into the ongoing conversation with God, others, and ourselves. The process is complex, involving many languages, cultures, and forms. Virginia Samuel Situk writes about the tasks of ministry in her book, What to Expect in Seminary, Theological Education as Spiritual Formation. That no other professional is expected to be willing to face and wrestle with life's biggest questions and challenges with courage and wisdom and walk fearlessly with others to the edges of this life while helping them to make their peace with God. She goes on to write that many theological schools in the moderate to liberal Protestant tradition seem not to be structured in such a way as to assist or promote students' personal spiritual formation. She notes Janet Fishburne's survey of theological schools, which revealed that schools are grappling with paying attention to students' spiritual formation. However, they are at a loss about how to do it well. To reset the table or reframe theological education for formation requires intentionality. It requires a view of theological education beyond the intellectual pursuit to the larger frame, which includes spiritual formation in a purposeful, committed way. This, I believe, can happen in several ways. Faculty keep in the forefront that they encounter the whole person each time a class meets for instruction. Material is introduced in a way which allows for integration and reflection on its theological application. In so doing, the student draws on his or her prior experience, tradition, culture, context, scripture, and other courses. This is formation in action. New Brunswick, being intentional about addressing the whole person, introduced a course which specifically addresses call and formation. It is a required course taken in the first year that introduces the exploration of calling and vocational discernment for ministry. Practicing spiritual disciplines are required, which may include but not limited to prayer, meditation, study, fasting, solitude, service, silence, and journaling. It is also designed to prepare students for what to expect as a part of their time engaged in theological education. Self-care and financial health are covered as well, both areas of formation. The more spiritually formed a student is, the more likely the student will be able to help form others under his or her spiritual care. It is understood that most of our students are working full-time while attending seminary, which provides opportunities for stress. Interestingly, perhaps the trade-off for virtual learning on Zoom is less levels of stress and the convenient participation in class without precious time lost in travel and with family. It is possible to encourage community in a virtual environment. Students may still gather, quote unquote, via Zoom for study groups, peer conversations, and working on projects together. Community is formed through contact and communication. Although Zoom sessions are not ideal, they provide the connection, bringing students together, creating lasting and long-term relationships of support and collegiality that is a part of formation. As the needs of the church become more complex and denominational requirements shift, the student who has engaged the work of seminary and who invests in his or her own formation along with what is provided by the seminary will be positioned to move with the church to next level ministry. We do not know how long we will be in this uncertain transition or situation, but going forward, the framework for theological education may never be what it once was. As seminaries model navigating virtual ministry, our students may be better prepared to lead others in this new normal. And finally, as with the sons of Issachar, found in 1 Chronicles 12 and 32, the seminary must discern the times and move accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you both. This is our to begin to move the discussion from just Daniel and Faye, though certainly now Daniel and Faye can engage each other if they wish, to the rest of the group. So I invite you to find your electronic hand and raise it if you've got a question you'd like to ask or something you'd like to say or something you'd like to see us be addressing in this.
Well, I was a little late to the seminar, but I'm grateful. While I haven't fulfilled, pastoral ministry in the way that I expected, I can identify pre-COVID the stressors that we all encountered in various ways, and I was amazed. I wasn't alone, but I was essentially, driving 80 miles one way to New Brunswick and back from Peekskill in the Hudson Valley. And my mom was in dementia care up in Hudson, New York, and it was the long goodbye. And a lot of things, have always been, stressful for me in my background because I'm a caretaker. But, I really identify a lot of what Dan was saying. I'm in the Presbyterian side at the moment, in the church of my formation, I might add. But they're very, very cautious in using Zoom. And to get together, and it's just congregation of 50 in a more of a little village urban context. But it's been very, very stressful and feeling, very disjointed in a Zoom world. And how do you present the message without, people want to connect and belong, but it's very frustrating. We try to manage on session to, bridge the gap, and we're sort of doing a hybrid, but then you have people who are more or less elderly who are afraid to come out and won't come out. And those who are a group of willing who are will sit in a chilly church and have the windows open and everybody's masked up. And then we're out the door and there's, no fellowship, no sense of belonging. And the one thing that I remember about in the Reformed tradition was a sense of belonging. And no matter what, when we pushed our way through the door at New Brunswick, we were all in the same boat. And we supported one another, and not to have that community that we had, and I miss that community very much, but I appreciate, is it Dr. Faye? With the amazing approach, and yes, as far as the formation, that really speaks to me, and I wish I had some more of that while I was at New Brunswick, and especially coming through the door. I mean, we got it eventually, but we were all running around like our hair was on fire. And but we all loved each other and supported each other no matter who, and people from around the world. It was an amazing experience, and Zoom kind of in this environment kind of cuts that off. It's a dilemma. I'm not, adding any solutions, but just from my experience, I just wanted to share that.
Okay. Daniel?
I'd like to ask Dr. Taylor, I'm curious in terms of field education, how you managed field education as a formative experience when students doing field education were not present, when they had to do it virtually. I know how much, I supervise seminarians at Old First, as Anita would tell you, Anita Kira could witness that. I supervised students at Old First seminarians the whole time I was there. It became an important part of our congregational life together. Norman was one. A presence in the congregation, coffee hour. The feel of the neighborhood. Our neighborhood was part of the educational experience. How are you managing field ed as a formative experience when it's virtual?
Thank you for the question, Dan. I think it's a similar way that we're trying to manage it with the seminary. Many of the churches, of course, once we entered into the pandemic, had to pivot, and they had to go into using some kind of virtual platform to stay connected. Our students, many of them were able to assist even with that in terms of the media pieces. They were able to do that. But they still were able to participate in worship. They were able to participate in meetings that the church had, albeit via a Zoom platform or some other meeting platform. And so there still was a connection. Now, clearly, it's not the kind of connection that you would have with an on-site face-to-face placement. But there were still times after the worship services when people stayed on the Zoom for conversation, and if they had coffee, they had it in their own hands from their own kitchen. And so it was not the ideal experience, but they still were able to gain, meet goals, and perform with tasks, albeit different tasks in terms of their placement and their covenant with their supervisors and on their sites.
Has there been any sustained disciplined, researched articulation of any gains or losses in the experience in the theological seminaries?
Well, we have an association of theological field educators, and in that association, we're actually looking at the effect of having our students not be physically on site, and what has that done in their formation. So there's some ongoing research, yes, about what the the ramifications will end up being for this change. But we tried to keep the experience as organic as we could with an environment that we had. And I teach a class that accompanies the student's placement as well. And of course, that's on Zoom. It was challenging initially to be sitting in front of a screen with the students, but we were still able to engage in conversation, in theological reflection. We could do breakout groups for discussions and to come back. And so we've managed to adapt the best that in the best possible way that we could.
Thanks, Faye. Sharon Davidson, go ahead.
Hi, yes. I would just like to add to what Dr. Taylor just said, because right now I'm in her field education class. This is my third field education class. And during this experience, she has made it really easy for us. And I can say that I'm happy that I'm having this field education class right now, because it's helping me to balance this COVID and to do things I had to do. Even also with my internship, it's all still online, virtual. But even with it being virtual, the relationships that I have developed with the Reverend of the church, Reverend Alicia Bailey, and also the different with the congregation. So it has helped a lot, the field education, and also how Reverend Dr. Faye Taylor teaches us and guides us. She does an awesome job. She's always there. So even though we're in this pandemic, it's like we're not in this pandemic, because she's still there. She's still hands-on. We can still call her whenever we need her. She gives us advice, and it is helping us through this pandemic. And it helped me through my internship. And this is my last semester of an intern. So I thank God for Dr. Faye Taylor. I thank her for the internship, and I thank her for the church that she placed me with, because I was unsure about the church, and she placed me with an excellent church. So it also helped with my field education and my intern, and me prospering in my ministry, and also at New Brunswick.
Thanks, Sharon. Daniel?
Well, Dr. Taylor was talking about the various models that they were using in talking about residency and the difference of coming to the seminary and not coming to the seminary, and what it was like setting up courses. I was reminded that the mobility that we have taken for granted, the ability to like live in Elizabeth and then come to a class in New Brunswick, or even to live in Peekskill and come to a class in New Brunswick, is probably a passing phenomenon. It's certainly a capitalist middle class phenomenon. It's probably a white phenomenon that in terms of its orientation, it's a white dominance phenomenon. For much of human history and for most of theological education, we could not assume mobility in the same way. And being residential was extremely costly, was done because professors themselves were not mobile. And if you wanted to say, you had to make it was a matter of great sacrifices. And if I think about the milieu of the Old Testament, you only went to Jerusalem once or twice a year to worship at the temple. Synagogues were developed for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons they were developed is because there was no worship at home in the Torah. There was no worship at home or in your town in Joshua and Judges or in the First Samuel song. And so going to the temple once or twice or 3 times a year, if you had some wealth, was a big deal. And so you went and you stayed for a week. And the festivals, most of the Jewish festivals were up to a week long, because if you're going to make that trip, you're going to stay. So that required, for example, in the same way that Islam requires for the Hijaz, enormous capacity for putting up guests. And because it wasn't just hotels or for the Ramadan, it was you had to come to Jerusalem, you had to stay somewhere. We've lost that whole thing of going up to the temple once or twice a year because we assume our mobility. I'm gonna drive down whatever tomorrow, whatever, or even take the train. In the New Testament, mobility, the ability to come to worship was an upper class privilege. And we know that many of the slaves and married women who were married to pagan husbands did not have that luxury. And we read about this in Justin Martyr, for example, the difficulty of getting communion out to people who could not be present. So we've had the privilege of both, even the seminary that we lived in when we lived on campus assumed mobility, and commuting assumed. We will have to get used to new models of not being together and maybe getting together once or twice a year, and then for a week, and new models of hosting people. And New Brunswick Seminary might have to develop a whole list of people's homes who would welcome students staying with them, so that we can do these week-long, because we do long for that contact. You can do Eucharist over Zoom, but it's just not Eucharist. You want to get together. And I see Andy Bosserday there. I mean, the whole Ritter model includes getting together on several retreats and once or twice a year to get together and share these activities. So we may have to learn to balance Zoom life with occasional intense meeting together, person to person. All right, that's all I want to say. I wish I had written that last night.
But you got to it now.
I hadn't heard Dr. Taylor's talk yet, so.
That's right. Oh, I'll tell. I will witness to everybody that it was fascinating when we were talking about this last summer, as Faye mentioned. It was fascinating just because none of us knew quite what we were talking about, but we knew there was something there as we started. And just a minute or two with Faye and Daniel together, and all sorts of stuff was bubbling up. And finally I said, yes, do that. It will be good. Faye.
Thank you. I just want to say too, in my Methodist tradition, as we know, we have a class system, a system of classes where people didn't come together collectively to worship on a regular basis, but there was a circuit person or a class leader who met with people in their homes, to gather, to create that sense of community. And they would come to the house of worship, perhaps periodically. But I do think, as Dan mentioned, as Dr. Meter mentioned, that we're going to have to look at a combined model of how we're going to go forward, because I do believe that this virtual world is not going to leave us anytime soon. And so I think that the seminary has the task now to determine what that will actually look like, to make it as rich an experience as it can be for our students, as well as support the faculty and all that they will have to do to be retooled, to be able to create an atmosphere of ideal learning in a way in which many of us have not been exposed to ourselves. And so as faculty, we are learning along with our students in most times, but clearly in this particular time.
Roland Van Ness, though, threw in some wise words into the chat. He says his mic isn't working, but he points out there are some upsides to Zoom, especially regarding the diversity of participants, because we can include more people from more backgrounds. Even those who are in prison can now get degrees from Hope College, for example. I know there are students at New Brunswick who are living in all sorts of places, but engaged in classes at New Brunswick Seminary in various degree programs. And it's also true, I know here of our group today. I'm trying to remember, Roland, I think, is in the Midwest right now. I know Rick DeBrine is on, and he's in California having breakfast with our colloquy instead of lunch. all of this is possible because of Zoom. So there is that upside as well. Is there anybody else? Somebody like to raise a hand? Faye's up. Go ahead.
Just a quick comment to a point that Dr. Meter made. New Brunswick Seminary has been in partnership with Bethany Seminary in Indiana for the last year. Actually, it was an interesting connection that we made, but our students have been able to come together a couple of times in forums to have discussions. And so the Zoom atmosphere has provided the opportunity for us to engage other seminaries in other parts of the country, and our students have benefited from those rich conversations that come out of that.
Thank you, Faye. Anybody else? Any other thoughts, comments? Dwayne, would you like to talk out loud?
Sure, I can. So my question, can everybody hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Great. So my question is, we as pastors have to adapt on the fly based on all the things that are going on in the world. And so I'm curious if the seminary has considered teaching a course on how to use technology to maximize ministry for preaching and teaching, because admittedly, when we switched into the complete virtual world, I tried to teach my Bible study class the way I did when we were in person, and admittedly it was a train wreck until I figured it out. So I'll leave there and wait for my answers.
Faye, I don't know what's actually going on in faculty meetings, so you.
Yes, Pastor Dwayne, we have been in discussions about creating a course that indeed would address the issues of media and how churches can, and how pastors can be supported in the various forms, the various platforms and media, the various technologies that's available. So we have been in discussion about creating such a course because we understood that there would be a need, there was a need.
Andy, go ahead and unmute.
Yes, good afternoon or good morning to our West Coast friends. When I spent a brief period of time working with what's now called the Commissioned Pastor Program and shifting some of its educational material online. And in my head, I always had these kind of three components that were necessary for formation. There's like quality content delivered in a winsome way. There's practice that happens largely in a particular context. And then there's a kind of a community of support that can carry it through. And so my program, I was in Northern Michigan at the time. I had very few students who were even within drivable distance. And so we were using Google Hangouts back when it was like brand new technology and barely working, and people didn't always know their cameras were on. Like all the silly things that happen with Zoom now were even worse back then because nobody really had experience with it and had not been turned into a meme yet. But one of the things that always struck me was like our sessions where we actually got together via this electronic medium, as Dr. Meter noted, not super great for delivering content because of screen fatigue and the distances between it. And so I ended up creating kind of educational, the kind of formation program, if you will, was largely kind of independent content delivery. They watch videos, listen to podcasts, read articles, read books, all those kinds of things. And then the practices were context. That actually became easier because the students were not removed from a context, but were already in the context of their ministry. And then the time together was largely kind of spent in conversation. And so part of what I'm wondering, given that as kind of a foundation, my question is for New Brunswick, this shift from residential to having more Zoom, how do faculty help kind of shift their curriculum to help the students who may not be in the New Brunswick context practice their learning in context? And I know Dr. Taylor is a great one to answer that question because I know of her ministry.
Hi, it's nice to see you, Andrew. Well, I think the faculty, a couple of things have been in place. The administration has been very thoughtful about bringing in consultants that help us to determine how to best create classes, how to best create the best way to bring that course delivery to our students, innovative ways, creative ways, the possibilities that exist within the technology that we actually have. We're actually getting ready to change to look at a new learning management system that will be more interactive with our other systems so that students will have an easier time navigating the learning management system. But again, the faculty we've spent the last couple of months, each month we have a session now with the group who comes in and helps us to rethink how we create our classes, how we manage the material, how do we make sure that the content remains there, but also make sure that it's not too much content for students who are looking at a screen for 2.5 hours. And so it's an ongoing process. I think too that as we think about what seminary is going to look like going forward, we're going to always be in some kind of a hybrid mode. Right now we offer hybrid, which means that students can do it fully online, or they can do online and have some sessions that are in person. So we are doing some face-to-face sessions with our students, but I think that's going to be the model going forward. The one piece too that is important, as you say, how do we keep the students engaged when they're away from the screen? And so we're also looking at the kinds of materials, the flipped classroom where students are doing the reading outside of the classroom. They come into the class, into the session to be able to discuss and to reflect on what they're doing. And so we were trying to make sure that when they're away from the formal class setting, there are things that will still keep them stimulated, things that they still have to engage in their learning, in their own learning process. And that was a long answer to a short question, but.
But a long answer that looks like what it was appreciated from what I see in the chat. I also have to remember to turn off my own mute sometimes. Another comment from Roland: Zoom works as a supplement or a complement, but is harder to do 100% of the time, like distance learning usually brings. Students together at least a few times. Distance learning usually brings students together at least a few times a year. It can maintain community, but it's harder to build it, is his observation. Rick DeBrine.
Yeah, just picking up on what Roland said, I wonder if there's a difference in ages. I know that New Brunswick has a very diverse age demographic, but I served with Pomona Unified School District on a team that went to technology for testing. And I remember sitting in the meeting with some humor as the teachers were saying this was not going to work. And particularly the lower elementary and kindergarten teachers. And then coming back after the testing, and the kindergartners just aced it. The kindergarten teachers had a lot of problems, but the kindergartners aced it with no problem. And it was obviously because of their familiarity with technology. So when we talk about building community, I always wonder if a generation that has lived more with technology and Zoom, if it's really harder to build community on technology, or whether that's just normative for them.
Anybody want to take a shot at that before I call on Daniel, who may actually have an answer? Faye, you're muted.
I was thinking aloud. I think it's fairly normative. When you think about the platforms that are being used now, the Facebook, the Instagram, those kinds of things, and I think because of the popularity of those platforms, and if I'm answering this correctly, the students in a certain age bracket, certainly are more easily more easily move into that realm. I think that our student and our average age of our student probably, I think, is about 60. And so, and so there has been some need for new learning, for new skill sets that have happened. And our students, I think, for the most part, are doing well. And even in our congregations, I was talking to a colleague the other day who said that she has a 95-year-old member who texts on a regular basis and who gets on Zoom and who has embraced this technology. And so I guess it depends a lot on the person, but also, but I do think that that there's a generation that certainly moves into this process much more easily than others.
Daniel, try that a third time.
I think Mr. O'Brien's point or his question leads to what I had been wanting to say, and that's a matter of scale and format. My granddaughter, when we need help with anything online, we go to my granddaughter. She's 7. I mean, that's clear, right? I mean, we all know that, those of us who are elderly. And when I need some help on my cell phone, I go to my granddaughter. But at the same time, we know now, and there's a lot of research on this, that the screen time orientation of children can have strong negative effects on their larger development. And I can tell also with my grandchildren, the difference in play, that it's less freewheeling, it's less outside, it's less social, it's more controlled. There's a lot. I mean, unless we set up a play date, there's no play out in the street. There's no play in the yards. And they are almost addicted. My granddaughter would be on screen all the time if we let her, and we know that there's a detriment to that. So despite the fact that the medium is increasingly easily used by younger students, we know from watching children that's not the whole story and completely a good thing. And so I was thinking about scale and how when we live in a Zoom world, the scale of our learning is very small. Where when you teach at a blackboard and when you engage a class at a blackboard, for example, the scale of learning is much larger, more spacious. And I think in our culture, space and room is an increasingly important spiritual thing. It's not just the ability to gather together, it's also to be able to be in space. One of the things we noticed in New York City as a pastor after 9/11, that because of security concerns, there are fewer and fewer spaces where people could freely gather, where you would meet someone you didn't know. You could no longer gather in lobbies of buildings. You had to pass a security guard. There's less and less space. And I think we have to take into account the social effects and the sociological and spiritual effects of scale and space when we think about the confines that we put our learning into. And I have no direct, I mean, we're going to have to use Zoom, but we have to be aware of what's included by that in terms of spiritual, social, and spatial necessities and outcomes. That's all.
So right now I'd like to call on Amanda. She can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I was able to take Greek class last year online via Zoom. And just to talk about how I think a lot of it does have to do with how the class is taught and how that community is formed. And so when I think about my Greek class that I had for a full year with it was a small class of about 8 of us. But to me, it really did feel like we were sitting around a kitchen table doing our Greek work together. So just to say, I think that there is a huge part of that happens in that community that happens because of the format that it's in. So we were doing work together, we were reciting things together, we were looking up words together, we were doing all of that which created in and of itself a community. We had discussions, we had questions. And even right now, I'm in Intro to Old Testament with Dr. Tanner. And in that course, most of the time that we spend together is actually in small groups. So we change which small groups we're in. We're having discussions, we're having case studies, we're talking about things that come up in the church and how that relates to the readings that we're doing in the Old Testament. And so just to emphasize that, I think that a lot of that community building also has to do with how your classes are formatted when you are online together. If it's listening to a lecture, if it's doing things like that, you're not always getting that same type of community connection. And I don't know that it's going to fully replace what happens in the classroom, but I think it can accomplish many things. And as a lot of people have said, you do get more diversity within the classroom because you are able to bring people from other places and from other backgrounds. And we have people internationally now that are able to come in and participate that wouldn't be on those same conversations and calls. And so you're just able to hear more perspectives. And just to say that I have seen community be able to be built within Zoom classrooms, if it's done in the right way.
I believe you.
Yeah, so news from an actual practitioner. And it's good to, at least good for me to hear, because I don't always know how things are coming across. Anna Jackson had her hand up and now it's up again. So Anna, go ahead and speak.
Thank you. Yeah, you asked me for a question, but I'm on my phone and I don't always know how to work Zoom on the phone. So anyway, I just wanted to raise one thing in terms of ministerial formation that I think might get a little lost with technology and Zoom that was really important for me, especially as an introvert. And that is the learning that happens without you realizing it when you're in a setting. Just watching how people respond to situations, watching how the body language, listening to the conversations that go back and forth outside of a quote unquote learning environment that becomes really essential, I think, to also building formation. Yeah, where we are, there's a lot of conversations. Our congregation is very both progressive and conservative. And so there's always this pull, tug and war between should we mask, shouldn't we mask, should we sing, shouldn't we sing, all these kinds of things that are happening within the church. And I think as somebody who's being formed for ministry, seeing how the congregation handles that, seeing how ministers respond to that in live form really contributes also to the formation of that person for ministry. So I just wanted to raise that because I think I'm so very grateful for technology and Zoom and all the abilities that it's doing. And I don't think we'll ever go back. I think we're moving to something new that we don't even know yet. So I think that those things are important, but I do think there's still a place for in person.
Thank you, Anna. Any responses from our panelists?
Learning styles, variety of learning styles is something really important to take into account.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, everybody, for your time here and for sharing with us and listening. As I said, I hope that I see many of you next week at our presentation on Zwemer, and next month when we're talking about other kinds of ministries that we get trained for. And in the meantime, have a blessed Advent and a joyous Christmas if we don't see you next week. And thank you again. Have a good day.